The Great Pyramid was finished in just 20 years. That means builders placed one giant stone block every 2 minutes. But here's the weird part: every pyramid built after it was worse, smaller, weaker, and less perfect than the very first one. This doesn't make sense when you think about how people usually learn. When you master something, it takes many tries. You make mistakes. You test things that don't work. You get better over time. But Egypt's most amazing building appeared suddenly, fully perfect, with no practice runs before it. Then, for the next 2,000 years, Egyptian builders tried to copy it and couldn't do it. Tonight, we're going to look at why the timeline seems wrong, why the oldest pyramid is the best one, and what that tells us about who really knew how to build them. But the facts show us the opposite. The most advanced pyramid is the oldest one. And everything built after it got worse in how exact it was, in size, and in how well it was made. Step closer to the stones themselves, and the story we've been told starts to fall apart. All across the plateau, the blocks weigh tens of tons. Some weigh more than 70 tons. They fit together without any glue or cement. Their surfaces are ground so flat that modern engineers study them with amazement. The inside hallways line up perfectly with stars in the sky. The measurements contain math patterns that shouldn't have been discovered for thousands of years. And below the surface, where sand and time have been cleared away, the bedrock itself tells a different story. There are erosion patterns that don't match Egypt's climate when the pharaohs ruled. There's underground weathering that suggests the land was exposed during a wetter, older time period. The foundations were prepared long before the culture that took credit for them. This isn't wild guessing. Scientists who study rocks have documented it. Surveys have measured it. The ground remembers what the ancient texts don't say. Before we go further, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening tonight and what quiet hour keeps you company. The images you see are simply there to go along with the story, not required for it. Thank you for being here. Now, let's go deeper, because the question isn't whether the Egyptians used the pyramids. Ancient writings make that clear. Tombs, ceremonies, royal names all confirm Egyptian presence. The question is more subtle and far more unsettling. Did the Egyptian pharaohs create the knowledge that made the earliest pyramids possible? Or did they inherit something that was already ancient? Think about the timeline. The Great Pyramid is credited to Khufu of the 4th dynasty, around 2550 BC. Before this, Egypt built mastabas, low, rectangular tombs made of mud, brick and stone. Simple, practical, easy to understand. Then, within a single dynasty, there's a leap. Not slow progress, but a sudden arrival of knowledge so complete that it included inside rooms, special curved ceilings, perfect alignment with the stars, and building math that wouldn't be officially written down for another 2,000 years. There are no in-between steps in the record. No half-successful test pyramids. No evidence of the long, grinding process that human beings usually go through to learn difficult knowledge. Just perfection, then. Slowly forgetting. Later pyramids crack. They collapse. They use smaller stones, loose rubble fill, and cement to hold their shape. Pharaohs of the 5th and 6th dynasties tried to copy what Khufu's builders achieved, but the results were worse. The techniques got worse. The perfection faded. If Egyptian engineering got better over centuries, why does the timeline run backward? The stones themselves hold part of the answer. Early dynasty blocks are massive megalithic. Their edges are cut and fitted using methods later generations couldn't reproduce. Tool marks suggest technologies that leave little trace. Some researchers point to copper saws. Others point to grinding powders. But none fully explain the speed, the size, or how uniform everything is. Meanwhile, thousands of papyrus scrolls survive from ancient Egypt: government records, tax documents, letters, prayers, detailed lists of grain, animals, temple donations. But no blueprints. No building manuals. No step-by-step explanation of how to cut stones from quarries, move them, lift them, and position stones weighing more than a modern truck. Egypt recorded everything except this. Written silence can be as revealing as words carved in stone. What a civilization chooses not to explain sometimes matters more than what it announces. And the pyramids, Egypt's most famous monuments, are surrounded by a deep, careful quiet. Later pharaohs did leave records, though. Not of construction, of restoration. Ancient writings describe clearing sand from structures that were already ancient, repairing damage to monuments credited to gods, not kings, making sacred again spaces that had stood for so long their origins had passed into myth. The Egyptians spoke of the pyramids with respect, not as their own creations. They saw themselves as caretakers, protectors of something sacred that came before their rule. If they built them, why the humility? The deeper you dig, the stranger the evidence becomes. Beneath the Giza Plateau, researchers have found erosion marks that don't match the dry climate of Dynasty Egypt. Water weathering. Underground channels carved during periods of heavy rainfall that ended long before the 4th dynasty rose to power. Some geologists suggest the site was shaped during the African humid period, a climate phase, lasting from roughly 9000 to 5500 BC, when the Sahara Desert was green, and the Nile River flowed much heavier. If true, the foundations of Giza are older than the pyramids themselves, prepared by hands we have no name for. The alignment adds another layer. The Great Pyramid's orientation to true north is accurate to 3/60ths of a single degree. This precision is better than most modern buildings. It shows an understanding of astronomy, geometry, and the Earth's axis that goes beyond religious symbolism. Why does a tomb need to be aligned with such obsessive accuracy? And how did 4th Dynasty Egypt, emerging from thousands of years of simple farming life, possess the celestial knowledge to achieve it? Some argue it was inherited, that the astronomy understanding came before the structure itself, that the pyramids were not inventions but continuations. Egypt becomes, in this light, not the starting point of monument civilization, but a bridge. A culture that preserved what it did not create. A dynasty that restored what had already stood. A kingdom that turned into myth structures whose original purpose is no longer fully understood. The pyramids don't diminish Egypt. They elevate it. They reveal a civilization wise enough to protect knowledge it could not recreate, to honor monuments it could not rebuild, and to carry forward a legacy far older than its own recorded history. But if the Egyptians inherited the pyramids, the question shifts. Who prepared the ground? Who encoded the mathematics? Who lined the stone to the stars? And why did they build something designed to outlast the very memory of their existence? The answers may lie not in what the Egyptians said, but in what they could no longer explain. Not in their writings, but in their silence. And not in the height of the pyramids, but in the depth of the foundations beneath them. In the Cairo Museum, beneath glass and careful light, rests a diorite statue of Pharaoh Khafre, 4th Dynasty, around 2520 BC. The stone is among the hardest known to ancient Egypt, nearly impossible to carve with copper tools. Yet the surface is polished to a mirror finish. The angles are geometrically exact. The symmetry is flawless. No chisel marks remain. No trace of the method. Just results. This is the pattern that haunts Giza. Not the presence of ambition, but the absence of process. Human beings learn through mistakes. We build poorly before we build well. We fail, adapt, and refine. Every leap forward in engineering leaves behind a trail of abandoned experiments, half-finished test models. Structures that didn't quite work. This is how knowledge builds up slowly, visibly, with evidence. But Egypt's pyramids don't follow this rule. The building record should show us progression, early attempts at pyramid construction, modest projects, failures that taught lessons, a clear evolutionary sequence leading from simple tombs to the marvel on the Giza Plateau. Instead, we find compression. Mastabas, the flat-roofed rectangular tombs of Egypt's early dynasties, dominated architecture. For centuries. Mud brick, stone casing, functional but humble. No inside complexity. No star alignment. No geometric sophistication. Then, within the span of a single dynasty, Egypt produces Giza. Not gradually. Not through visible trial. The Great Pyramid simply appears in the timeline, fully realized, as though the knowledge arrived intact rather than earned through generations of labor and error. The Step Pyramid at Saqqara, built for Pharaoh Djoser one generation earlier, is often cited as the transition form, and it is impressive. 6 stacked platforms rising in tiers. A monumental statement. But examine it closely, and a gap remains. The Step Pyramid uses smaller stones. Its internal structure is simpler. Its alignment is approximate. It represents ambition, yes, but not the precision, not the scale, not the building mathematics that defined the Great Pyramid. Between Djoser and Khufu, something changes. Not slowly, radically. Consider what the Great Pyramid requires. Not just stone, but 2,300,000 blocks. Some weighing 70 tons. Quarried miles away. Transported across desert and river. Lifted into place with tolerances measured in fractions of inches. The king's chamber sits 140 feet above ground, constructed with granite beams weighing 50 tons each, positioned so precisely that the chamber remains structurally sound after 4,500 years. This is not the work of a civilization learning. This is the work of a civilization that already knows. Where did the knowledge come from? The official story suggests that Egyptian architects simply figured it out, that within a few decades, they mastered geometry, astronomy, logistics, and engineering at a level that wouldn't be seen again for thousands of years. That they developed techniques so effective, so sophisticated, that later dynasties couldn't copy them despite having access to the same resources, the same labor, the same stone. But if this knowledge was discovered during the 4th dynasty, why does it vanish so quickly afterward? The pyramids that follow Giza are smaller, less precise, structurally weaker. The Pyramid of Unas, built barely 2 centuries later, collapsed internally. The Pyramid of Pipi needed rubble filled to keep its shape. Later pharaohs struggled to achieve even a fraction of what Khufu's builders accomplished with the Paradis. This is not the pattern of progress. It's the pattern of inheritance followed by loss. Imagine a different scenario. Not that the Egyptians invented pyramid engineering, but that they inherited it. That the knowledge existed before the 4th dynasty, carried forward from an earlier time, an earlier tradition, perhaps an earlier preparation of the Giza site itself. Suddenly the timeline makes sense. The perfection comes first because it was never developed. It was passed down. The decline follows because the transmission was incomplete. Later generations had the ambition, the labor, the desire, but not the understanding. They built pyramids because pyramids were what their ancestors built. But the techniques, the precision, the purpose behind the measurements, those faded into ritual, into guessing, into myth. Egypt becomes not the creator but the inheritor. Not the inventor but the caretaker of something already ancient when the dynasties rose. And if that's true, then every pyramid on the plateau is not a beginning. It's an echo. So where is the trail? If human engineering requires experimentation, if mastery demands failure, if the Giza pyramids represent the peak of ancient construction, where are the structures that taught those lessons? Where are the monuments that came before? The casing stones are the first clue. Originally, the Great Pyramid of Giza was covered in polished white limestone, fitted so tightly that observers described the surface as seamless a mirror in the desert. Most of these stones were stripped away centuries ago, reused for Cairo's mosques and palaces. But a few remain at the base, still locked in place after more than 4,000 years. Examine the joints. The gap between stones measures 0.5 millimeter in some places. Less than the thickness of a human hair. No cement, no glue, just stone against stone, ground so flat that the bond is nearly airtight. Modern construction rarely achieves this level of precision. Ancient Egypt, according to the timeline, achieved it at the very beginning. This is the mystery that refuses to make sense. The oldest monumental pyramids, those credited to the 4th dynasty, display construction quality that later periods couldn't match. The direction is inverted. Instead of improvement over time, we see things getting worse. The Great Pyramid stands as the benchmark. 2,300,000 blocks. Average weight 2.5 tons. Some blocks in the King's Chamber exceed 50 tons. The entire structure rises to a height of 481 feet. Originally topped with a pyramidion that may have been gilded or polished to reflect sunlight. The base covers 13 acres. The 4 sides are oriented almost perfectly to the cardinal directions. The northern side deviates from true north by just 1/60th of a degree. The length of each side differs by no more than 2 inches across a span of over 750 feet. Achieving this required not just labor but knowledge, geometry, surveying, leveling techniques sophisticated enough to ensure the base sits flat despite the natural bumps of bedrock. And all of this, again, without the written manuals, the training schools, the step-by-step projects that should come before such mastery. Now compare this to what comes after. The Pyramid of Menkaure, built within the same dynasty, is significantly smaller. The stonework is less refined. The casing stones are larger, cruder, less tightly fitted. It still stands, but the precision has already diminished. Move forward 2 centuries. The 5th dynasty attempts to continue the tradition. The Pyramid of Userkaf. The Pyramid of Sahir. The Pyramid of Neferkare. Each one is smaller than the last. The internal chambers are simpler. The stone blocks decrease in size, often filled with rubble and cement to keep structural integrity. Some collapse entirely. The Pyramid of Neferkare was never finished. Its casing was never applied. What remains is a step-like core, exposed and eroding, a skeleton of ambition without the skill to complete it. By the 6th dynasty, the decline is unmistakable. The Pyramid of Teti shows internal cracks. The Pyramid of Pepi II, though once the tallest of its era, has deteriorated into a mound of rubble. Its outer structure couldn't support its own weight over time. These are not improvements. They're approximations, copies made by builders who understood the form but had lost access to the method. Even Egyptologists acknowledge this pattern. Traditional scholarship describes the 4th dynasty as the golden age of pyramid construction. After Giza, the techniques degrade. The resources may have been redirected. The political will may have weakened. But the knowledge itself demonstrably weakens. Why? If pyramid building was a learned skill refined through practice, then later dynasties should have built better pyramids, not worse. They had access to the same quarries, the same labor force, the same organizational systems. They had the Great Pyramid itself as a reference, of physical blueprints standing right there on the plateau. And yet they failed to copy it. This suggests something uncomfortable. That the knowledge required to build Giza was not developed during the 4th dynasty. That it was applied but not created. That the architects of Khufu's era possessed techniques passed down from an earlier source. Techniques they themselves may not have fully understood. When you inherit a tool without understanding how it was made, you can use it. But you can't repair it. You can't improve it. And eventually, you lose it. The later pyramids feel like monuments built by people imitating an older standard. The shape is familiar. The intention is clear. But the engineering behind it has faded into guessing, ritual repetition without technical understanding. The stone remembers what the culture forgot. So the question sharpens. If the 4th dynasty represents the peak, not the beginning of pyramid engineering, then where did the foundational knowledge come from? Who first understood the geometry, the alignment, the structural principles that made Giza possible? And why does history offer no answer? In 1991, geologist Robert Schoch stood at the base of the Sphinx enclosure and noticed something the historians had not. The walls surrounding the Sphinx, carved directly from the limestone bedrock of the Giza Plateau, showed deep vertical erosion patterns. Not the kind caused by wind and sand, which creates horizontal lines, but the kind caused by water-heavy, sustained rainfall running down the stone in sheets over long periods of time. Egypt's dynasty period, beginning around 3100 BC, was dry. The climate had been dry for thousands of years by the time the pharaohs rose to power. Rainfall in the region was minimal, occasional, incapable of producing the type of erosion visible in the Sphinx enclosure. Schoch's conclusion was careful, geological, not wild guessing. The erosion suggested the stone had been exposed during a much wetter climate, a climate that ended long before the 4th dynasty. This observation opened a question that extends beyond the Sphinx. If the bedrock shows evidence of weathering from an earlier, wetter period, what does that mean for the structures built upon it? The Giza Plateau itself is not a flat, featureless surface. It's a carefully prepared foundation. Bedrock has been leveled in places, trenches carved, underground channels shaped to redirect water and stabilize the ground. This kind of site preparation requires planning, labor, and time. But according to the accepted timeline, all of this work happened during the 4th dynasty in the brief decades before construction began. Quarrying, transportation, foundation work, and the building of the pyramids themselves all compressed into a single generation. Geologically, the ground tells a different story. The African humid period, a climate phase lasting roughly from 9000 to 5500 BC, transformed the Sahara. What is now desert was once grassland. Lakes dotted the landscape. Rivers flowed where sand now lies. The Nile carried greater volume. Rainfall was regular, sometimes heavy. During this period, the Giza Plateau would have experienced weather capable of producing the erosion patterns visible today. Water would have carved channels, weathered exposed stone, shaped the underground in ways that the dry dynasty climate could not. If parts of the plateau show this type of weathering, it suggests exposure during that wetter year. Exposure, not being covered. Preparation, not construction. In other words, the ground may have been worked long before the pyramids rose. This is not fringe geology. Climate data from ice cores, sediment layers, and pollen records confirm the African humid period. Archaeologists have documented settlements and tool use across the Sahara during this time, evidence of human presence in regions that would later become uninhabitable desert. What remains uncertain is the extent of that presence. Were these small, scattered groups of hunter-gatherers? Or could organized, knowledgeable communities have existed capable of recognizing the Giza Plateau as a site worth preparing for future use? The rock itself can't answer that question, but it can tell us when it was last shaped by water and when it was sealed beneath stone. Underground surveys using ground-penetrating radar have revealed oddities beneath the plateau: voids, chambers, passages that don't correspond to known structures. Some of these features sit below the level of the pyramids, carved directly into bedrock. Their purpose unclear. The traditional explanation suggests these are natural cracks or later changes. But the geometry in some cases is too regular, the alignment too deliberate, and the depth places them in layers that suggest they were accessible or even created long before the 4th dynasty. One example lies beneath the causeway connecting the Sphinx to the pyramid complex. Seismic studies have detected rectangular cavities, evenly spaced, arranged in a pattern that resembles intentional digging. No official excavation has been conducted to verify their nature. No public records explain their origin. The Giza Plateau, in this light, becomes more than the site of pyramids. It becomes a palimpsest, layers of use separated by thousands of years. The dynasty Egyptians built upon ground that had already been modified, shaped, perhaps even marked for significance by earlier hands. The question is not whether the plateau was used before the 4th dynasty. Climate evidence and underground features suggest it was. The question is how it was used and by whom. Did earlier inhabitants recognize the bedrock stability? Did they level sections in preparation for future construction they themselves would never complete? Or did they leave behind something more? Structures or knowledge that the Egyptians later inherited and built upon. Geology doesn't offer certainty. It offers context. And the context here is older than the history we've been taught. The Egyptians didn't choose Giza randomly. The site was already significant, already prepared, already tied to something that came before the dynasty, something that required the kind of foresight, organization, and effort that we associate with civilizations, not scattered nomadic groups. Erosion is a silent record. Water carves truth into stone. And the truth here is that the ground remembers a time before Egypt. A time when the plateau was worked under open skies and steady rain, when the Nile flowed heavier and the desert had not yet claimed the land. The pyramids sit on top of that memory, but they don't explain it. If the bedrock carries traces of preparation from an era thousands of years before the pharaohs, then who worked it? Who saw the value in this plateau when it was still green, still wet, still distant from the world that would one day call it the center of divine kingship? And what did they know that caused them to begin? In 1822, Jean-François Champollion deciphered the Rosetta Stone and unlocked the hieroglyphic script. Within decades, scholars could read thousands of years of Egyptian writing, tax records, religious hymns, medical texts, love letters, prayers, shopping lists. Egypt documented its world obsessively. Scribes recorded grain deliveries, cattle counts, the names of workers, the wages paid in bread and beer. Temples kept inventories of ritual objects down to the smallest charm. Tombs preserved autobiographies of minor officials, their careers detailed across limestone walls. The written record is vast, careful, and maddeningly specific. And yet, nowhere in this ocean of texts is there a single document explaining how to build a pyramid. No building manual. No engineering guide. No step-by-step instructions for quarrying, transporting, or positioning multi-ton blocks of stone. No diagrams showing the internal layout of the Great Pyramid's chambers. No math formulas describing the slope angles, the corbelling techniques, or the star alignments. The silence is not partial. It's total. This is strange because the Egyptians did leave construction records. The Diary of Mir, a logbook discovered in 2013 at Wadi al-Jurf, describes the transportation of limestone blocks from the Tura quarries to Giza during the reign of Khufu. It details the number of workers, the boats used, the routes taken. It's administrative, practical, concerned with logistics. But it says nothing about why the blocks were cut to those specific sizes. Nothing about how the internal chambers were planned. Nothing about the knowledge required to align the structure so precisely to the cardinal points. It records the movement of stone, not the understanding behind the design. The contrast is telling. For smaller projects, instructions survive. The construction of a minor temple, the renovation of a tomb, these sometimes include sketches, measurements, notes on materials. But for the pyramids, the largest and most complex structures Egypt ever produced, there is nothing. One explanation is loss. Papyrus is fragile. Time, humidity, and fire have destroyed much. It's possible that construction manuals existed and simply didn't survive. But consider what did survive. The Rhind mathematical papyrus, dated to around 1650 BC over a thousand years after the pyramids, contains geometry problems and practical calculations. The Edwin Smith papyrus preserves surgical techniques. The Ebers papyrus lists medical remedies. These texts endured because they were copied, referenced, valued. If pyramid construction manuals existed, if the knowledge was understood and actively used, why weren't they copied? Why do later texts never reference them, never quote them, never build upon them? The silence suggests something unsettling. That the knowledge was not written down because it was not fully understood by those who applied it. That the techniques were inherited, practiced, but not intellectually mastered in a way that could be written into teachable rules. Builders can follow instructions without grasping the principles behind them. Masons can copy patterns without understanding the mathematics. Laborers can move stones according to a plan designed by someone else, someone whose reasoning is no longer accessible. If the 4th dynasty architects inherited a design, a method, a set of procedures from an earlier tradition, they might have executed it faithfully, without being able to explain it in writing. The knowledge would have been practical, procedural, passed orally or through demonstration. And when the generation that understood it died, the knowledge died with them. This would explain the decline. Later dynasties had the records of logistics, the lists of materials, the evidence that pyramids had been built. But they didn't have the underlying principles. They attempted to copy the form without access to the foundation. It also explains the written gap. You can't write a manual for something you don't conceptually understand. You can describe what was done but not why it worked. The Diary of Mir is a perfect example. Detailed logistics, zero theory. Egyptian scribes recorded what they knew. They were excellent at administration, at tracking resources, at documenting ritual. But engineering theory, especially the kind required for Giza, may have existed outside the scribal tradition entirely. Or it may have existed before the scribal tradition began. Consider the timeline again. Writing in Egypt emerges around 3200 BC, shortly before the First Dynasty. The pyramids appear within 500 years. If the core knowledge behind pyramid construction came before the invention of writing, it would never have been recorded in the first place. It would have been passed down through other means: apprenticeship, observation, physical models, or it would have been encoded directly into the structures themselves, preserved not in words but in stone. The pyramids become, in this reading, their own manuals. The dimensions, the angles, the alignments, all of it contains information. Not story information, but mathematical, astronomical, geometric information embedded in physical form. Later generations could measure the pyramids. They could observe the results. But without the conceptual framework, without the knowledge of why those specific numbers mattered, they couldn't recreate the precision. They inherited the answer but not the equation. This is why the later pyramids approximate rather than replicate. The builders saw what Giza looked like. They understood it was important. But they didn't understand how it was conceived. And so they built pyramids that look correct from the outside, while lacking the internal coherence. The structural integrity, the encoded knowledge that made Giza extraordinary. The Egyptians were not frauds. They were inheritors of something too complex to fully reconstruct. They preserved what they could, honored what they didn't understand, and passed it forward as myth, as ritual, as sacred tradition. But the original blueprint, if it ever existed in written form, is gone. Or it was never written at all. So we return to the question. If a civilization records everything, tracks every transaction, names every minor official, why does it remain silent on its greatest building achievement? What does it mean when the most sophisticated knowledge leaves no written trace? In 1865, astronomer Charles Piazzi Smith conducted the first detailed survey of the Great Pyramid's orientation. Using instruments calibrated for precision work, he measured the alignment of the structure's sides to the cardinal directions. The northern face of the pyramid deviates from true north by 3 arc minutes. That's the 60th of a single degree. An error margin so small that it surpasses many modern buildings constructed with laser theodolites and GPS. This was not religious symbolism. This was technical mastery. Aligning a structure to true north is more difficult than it appears. True north is not the same as magnetic north. Magnetic north shifts over time, influenced by the Earth's magnetic field. True north is fixed, determined by the planet's axis of rotation. To find it requires astronomical observation, patience, and mathematical correction. The Egyptians had no compasses, no satellites, no electronic instruments. What they had was the night sky, and the ability to track the movement of stars over long periods. One method involves observing a circumpolar star that never sets below the horizon and marking its positions at regular intervals as it rotates around the celestial pole. By bisecting the arc of its movement, you can determine true north. This requires sustained observation, clear weather, precision in measurement. And even then, small errors build up. Achieving accuracy within 3 arc minutes suggests not just skill but a depth of star knowledge unusual for a civilization supposedly emerging from thousands of years of simple farming life. But the alignment is only the beginning. The Great Pyramid's dimensions encode relationships that go beyond random design. The ratio of the pyramid's height to the perimeter of its base approximates 2a. This means that if you divide the perimeter by twice the height, you approach the value of pi roughly 3.1416. Pi is the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. It's a fundamental constant in geometry. The Greeks would later formalize it. Archimedes would calculate it to remarkable precision in the 3rd century BC, nearly 2,000 years after Giza was built. Yet the pyramid reflects it, embedded in stone. Some argue this is coincidence, that the builders chose proportions for aesthetic or structural reasons, and the mathematical relationship emerged accidentally. But the precision of the alignment, combined with the encoded ratio, suggests intentionality. The structure was designed by people who understood geometric principles at a level that shouldn't exist in the archaeological record of early dynasty Egypt. Compare this to later Egyptian monuments. The temples at Karnak and Luxor, constructed over many dynasties, show careful alignment to solar and stellar events. The rising sun on solstices, the heliacal rising of Sirius. These alignments are religiously significant, tied to farming cycles and divine mythology. But they're not as precise as Giza. The tolerances are wider. The engineering is impressive, but it doesn't approach the obsessive accuracy of the Great Pyramid's orientation. This suggests a difference in purpose. Later temples were aligned for ritual observation, for marking sacred time. Giza was aligned for something else, something that required exactness beyond symbolism. One possibility is geodetic knowledge. The Great Pyramid sits almost exactly on the 30th parallel, 30 degrees north latitude. Its position on the globe is not random. It occupies a location of geometric significance, a third of the way between the equator and the pole. Some researchers have noted that the pyramid's location also corresponds to the center of Earth's landmass, the point where the most continental surface area radiates outward. Whether this is intentional or coincidental remains debated, but the placement is mathematically noteworthy. If the builders possessed knowledge of Earth's dimensions, of latitude, of the planet's shape and surface distribution, that knowledge vastly exceeds what the traditional timeline credits to early Egypt. Such understanding would require long-term observation, mapping, calculation. It would require cultural continuity of star study spanning not decades but centuries, perhaps thousands of years. The 4th dynasty lasted roughly 120 years. Not long enough to develop this depth of knowledge from scratch. Not long enough to refine the mathematics, test the methods, and encode them into a structure with such finality. Which brings us back to inheritance. If the knowledge was not developed during the 4th dynasty, it must have been passed down from an earlier source. Egyptian star texts, such as the star charts found in tombs and temples, show familiarity with constellations, with the solar year, with lunar cycles. But they don't show the advanced geometric and geodetic understanding implied by Giza's design. The knowledge appears, is applied, and then fades. Later pyramids are less precise. Later temples, while astronomically aligned, lack the mathematical encoding visible at Giza. The sophistication is not built upon. It's not expanded. It's diluted. This is the pattern of inherited knowledge applied without full understanding. The builders knew how to execute the design. They understood the importance of alignment. But the deeper reasons, the original purpose behind the precision, may have been lost to them. Even as they worked, ritual often preserves fragments of older knowledge without understanding its origin. A ceremony might require facing east at dawn, long after the astronomical significance of that direction has been forgotten. The form persists, but the meaning erodes. Giza's alignment may represent something similar, a design inherited from a tradition that understood Earth's geometry, the sky's mechanics, the mathematical constants that govern physical space. The fourth dynasty executed the plan. Later dynasties honored it. But the conceptual foundation, the why beneath the how, receded into the realm of the sacred. And sacred things are revered, not questioned. The stars still wheel overhead, indifferent to the stones below. The pyramid still points north, silent and exact. The mathematics still hold, encoded in proportion and angle, waiting for minds capable of reading them. But the original intent, the purpose that demanded such accuracy, remains unanswered. If alignment this precise was not needed for religious ritual, if it surpassed the practical requirements of a royal tomb, then what function did it serve? What kind of knowledge system builds monuments that encode pi, align to fractions of a degree, and sit at geodetically significant locations? And who taught the Egyptians to preserve it? On the granite walls of the Temple of Edfu, built during the Ptolemaic period around 237 BC, an inscription describes the foundation of Egypt's sacred architecture. It doesn't credit pharaohs or dynasties. Instead, it speaks of the primeval age, a time when divine beings laid out the original plans for temples on ground that was already ancient. The text refers to these structures as having been built according to writings which came down from the sky. Later rulers, the inscription suggests, were not creators but restorers, tasked with maintaining what had been established long before their reigns. This is not an isolated text. Egyptian inscriptions consistently frame monumental architecture as something inherited, not invented. Pharaoh Khemwiset, son of Ramesses II, earned the title, the first Egyptologist, not for building new monuments, but for restoring old ones. His inscriptions at Saqqara described clearing sand from structures whose origins were already unclear by his time, around 1200 BC, over 1,000 years after the pyramids were built. He didn't claim to have built these monuments. He claimed to have rescued them from neglect, to have repaired damage, to have renewed offerings at altars already ancient when he found them. His language is that of a caretaker, not a creator. This pattern repeats across dynasties. The dream stele placed between the paws of the Sphinx by Thutmose IV around 1400 BC recounts how the prince cleared sand from the monument after the Sphinx itself appeared to him in a dream, requesting liberation from the desert that threatened to consume it. The inscription treats the Sphinx as a being with its own consciousness, older than memory, deserving of respect and care. Thutmose doesn't present himself as the sculptor or architect. He presents himself as the one who heard his plea and answered. Even Khufu, to whom the Great Pyramid is credited, left little direct testimony about its construction. His name appears in quarry marks inside the structure, and later traditions assign the pyramid to him. But Khufu's own inscriptions don't boast of engineering, brilliance, or building innovation. They speak instead of ritual, of divine favor, of maintaining cosmic order. The emphasis is on continuity, not originality. This is strange because Egyptian pharaohs were not modest. They advertised their victories. They listed their conquered lands. They described their building projects in exhaustive, self-glorifying detail. When Ramesses II completed a temple, he made sure everyone knew. Inscriptions proclaimed his power, his piety, his superiority over all who came before. So why the silence around the pyramids? Why the language of restoration instead of creation? One possibility is that by the time later dynasties rose to power, the true origin of the pyramids had already faded into uncertainty. The structures stood massive and undeniable, but their builders had become mythological. The knowledge that made them possible was no longer accessible. And so, rather than falsely claim authorship of something they couldn't copy, the pharaohs framed themselves as protectors, guardians of a sacred inheritance, maintainers of structures placed there by forces older and wiser than themselves. This reframing elevates the monuments. If the pyramids were merely royal tombs built by human hands for human glory, then later pharaohs could have dismissed them, built larger, claimed superiority. But instead, they treated them with reverence. They cleared them. They repaired them. They consecrated them. They approached them as one approaches relics. The inventory stela, discovered near the Great Pyramid and dated to around 660 BC during the 26th dynasty, contains a curious passage. It describes Khufu discovering the Sphinx and the temples around it already present, buried in sand. According to the stela, Khufu didn't build these monuments. He uncovered them. Mainstream Egyptology considers the stela later fabrication an attempt by 26th dynasty priests to retroactively assign antiquity to structures whose origins were disputed even in their time. But whether the stela is authentic or not, its existence reveals something important. By the late dynasty period, there was already a tradition, a belief that the monuments of Giza predated the 4th dynasty, that they were inheritances, not innovations. This belief persisted into the classical era. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, recorded what Egyptian priests told him about the pyramids. They spoke of Khufu and Khafre, but they also spoke of earlier ages, of rulers whose names were forgotten, of times when Egypt itself was different. The priests didn't present a clear linear history. They presented layers, dynasties built upon dynasties, monuments inherited and repurposed, knowledge fragmentary, passed through ritual rather than record. Even the names of the pyramids reflect this. In later texts, the Great Pyramid is not called the pyramid Khufu built. It's called the Horizon of Khufu, as though Khufu occupied it, claimed it, made it his symbolic resting place, but didn't originate it. Language matters. The distinction between occupying a space and creating it is not trivial. If the Egyptians themselves believed they were inheritors, if their own inscriptions emphasize preservation over authorship, then perhaps the traditional narrative which insists the pyramids were wholly Egyptian inventions misreads the culture it claims to represent. Egypt didn't need to invent the pyramids to be extraordinary. The achievement lies not in origination, but in stewardship, in recognizing the value of what came before, in maintaining structures across thousands of years, in keeping them sacred, in ensuring that even when the purpose was forgotten, the form endured. This is a different kind of greatness. Not the brilliance of innovation, but the wisdom of continuity. Not the pride of creation, but the humility of inheritance. And perhaps that humility is itself evidence that the Egyptians knew something we have forgotten. That the pyramids were already ancient when the dynasties rose. That the knowledge required to build them came from somewhere older, somewhere lost, somewhere the pharaohs themselves couldn't name. If Egypt's own rulers didn't claim to have built the pyramids, if their inscriptions describe uncovering, restoring, and honoring, rather than designing and constructing, then why do we insist they were the creators? What did the Egyptians know about their own monuments that later history chose to ignore? In the Cairo Museum, 2 stone vases sit side by side. Both are made of diorite, one of the hardest stones available in ancient Egypt. The first vase dates to the pre-dynastic period, before 3000 BC. The second dates to the New Kingdom, around 1300 BC, nearly 2,000 years later. The older vase is flawless. Its walls are uniformly thin. Its interior is hollowed with precision. Its surface is polished to a reflective shine. The craftsmanship is so refined that modern stone workers have struggled to copy it even with rotary tools. The later vase is rougher, thicker. Walls, irregular surfaces, tool marks visible where the earlier piece shows none. This is not an isolated comparison. It's a pattern that extends across Egyptian material culture. The oldest examples of stone craftsmanship are often the finest, and over time the quality diminishes. This inverts the expected path of technological progress. Civilizations are supposed to improve. Techniques refine. Tools advance. Knowledge builds up and grows upon itself, each generation standing on the shoulders of the last. But in Egypt, the curve runs backward. The granite sarcophagus in the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid weighs approximately 3½ tons. It was carved from a single block of red granite transported from Aswan over 500 miles away. The interior corners are perfectly square. The walls are smooth and uniform. The exterior is undecorated, yet the precision of the cutting suggests tools and methods capable of working one of the hardest natural stones with extraordinary control. No comparable sarcophagus was ever made again. Later pharaohs attempted to copy the style, but the results are noticeably worse. Corners are less precise. Surfaces are rougher. The stone is softer, easier to work, as though the knowledge required to handle granite at that level had faded. This pattern appears in architecture as well. Early dynasty construction relies on megalithic blocks and weighing 50, 70, even 80 tons. These blocks are fitted together without cement. Their edges are ground so flat that they sit flush across tons of weight. By the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BC, the blocks have shrunk 10 tons, 5 tons easier to move but structurally weaker. Cement begins to appear, filling gaps that earlier techniques would have eliminated entirely. By the late period, after 1000 BC, construction increasingly relies on mud brick, wood, and smaller stone. The monumental scale persists in some temples, but the engineering has simplified. The complexity has been traded for practicality. This is not a story of resource scarcity. Egypt still had access to granite, still had access to limestone, still had labor forces capable of moving stone. What it no longer had was the knowledge to work at the scale and precision of the 4th dynasty. Tool marks provide another clue. Early stonework sometimes shows evidence of techniques that leave almost no trace: perfectly flat surfaces, drill holes with spiral grooves, suggesting rapid, controlled boring. Saw cuts through granite that imply abrasives or methods beyond simple copper tools. Later stonework shows chisel marks, pounding, abrasion. The marks are visible, the process slower, the results less refined. The tools became simpler because the advanced techniques were no longer understood. Speed also changed. The Great Pyramid, according to traditional estimates, was completed in roughly 20 years. 2,300,000 blocks. That requires setting a block every 2 to 3 minutes, continuously. Day and night, for 2 decades. Later pyramids took longer to build, yet they're smaller, simpler, and less durable. The pace of construction slowed even as the ambition shrank. This suggests not just a loss of technique, but a loss of organizational knowledge, the logistics, the coordination, the systems that made rapid large-scale construction possible. All of it degraded over time. Cultural continuity remained. Egypt endured for 3,000 years. The language evolved but stayed recognizable. The religion adapted but retained core elements. The artistic style remained consistent across dynasties. Egypt was continuous, stable, remarkably resilient. But technical knowledge fragmented. Skills that required deep understanding, that depended on training, on experience passed directly from master to apprentice, these faded when the chain of transmission broke. Oral traditions are fragile. When a generation of craftsmen dies without fully training the next, the knowledge dies. With them, what remains are approximations, people who remember the outcome but not the method, who know that stones must be fitted tightly, but not how to achieve tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. And so they do their best. They produce work that looks similar, that fulfills the same symbolic function, but lacks the underlying coherence. The form persists, but the essence erodes. Egypt, in this reading, becomes a bridge of civilization that stood between an older world and a younger one, carrying forward fragments it couldn't entirely reconstruct. The pyramids, the precision stonework, the star alignments, these were inheritances from a time when knowledge systems existed that Egypt preserved but didn't create. The 4th dynasty applied this knowledge at its peak. Later dynasties watched it fade, tried to maintain it, but ultimately could only honor it. This doesn't diminish Egypt. It reframes it. The greatness lies not in having invented everything, but in having saved what could be saved, in maintaining continuity across centuries when other civilizations collapsed entirely, in recognizing that some things were too important to abandon, even when they were no longer fully understood. The temples kept operating. The rituals continued. The monuments stood. And through them, the memory persisted, not as clear history but as myth, as reverence, as sacred inheritance. But memory is not knowledge. Memory can preserve the shape of something, without preserving its function. The Egyptians remembered that the pyramids were important. They remembered that alignment mattered. They remembered that certain proportions were sacred. But they could no longer engineer at the level required to produce another Giza. The techniques had slipped away gradually, quietly, not through catastrophe, but through the slow erosion of specialized knowledge across generations who valued tradition more than innovation, who sought to preserve rather than surpass. And so the question circles back, sharper now, informed by every chapter that came before. If Egypt's path is one of decline from an initial peak, if the knowledge fades rather than grows, if the oldest works are the finest and the later works are approximations, then the knowledge didn't originate in Egypt. It was passed to Egypt, applied during a brief brilliant window, and then slowly lost. So where did it come from? What culture, what people, what forgotten chapter of history possessed the understanding that made Giza possible? And why does the ground itself older then? The dynasties still bear the marks of their presence. Most ancient structures collapse within centuries. Wood rots. Mud brick dissolves. Even stone exposed to the elements erodes and crumbles. Temples fall. Palaces vanish beneath soil. Entire cities fade into mounds that later generations mistake for hills. The pyramids, by contrast, have stood for over 4,500 years, and they show no sign of imminent failure. This is not luck. This is engineering for permanence. Consider the material choices. Limestone is abundant in Egypt, easy to quarry, and relatively soft when first cut. But once exposed to air, it hardens, becoming more resistant to weathering over time. The core blocks of the Great Pyramid are rough-cut limestone, massive and stable, designed not for beauty, but for load-bearing endurance. The casing stones, originally polished Tur limestone, were harder still. They reflected sunlight, yes, but they also formed a protective shell, shedding rain and wind, preventing erosion from reaching the core. Even after most casing stones were removed, the underlying structure remained intact. Granite was used sparingly but strategically. The king's chamber is lined with granite. The relieving chambers above it, designed to distribute the immense weight of the pyramid away from the burial space, are constructed from granite beams, weighing 50 tons each. Granite is nearly indestructible. It doesn't crack under pressure the way limestone does. It resists weathering. Far better than softer stone. The choice to use granite in the most structurally critical areas suggests that whoever designed the pyramid understood material science at a level that prioritized longevity over ease of construction. They weren't building for a generation. They were building for geological time. The shape itself contributes to survival. A pyramid is inherently stable. Its mass is concentrated at the base. Its profile minimizes wind resistance. and its geometry distributes weight evenly across the foundation. There are no weak points, no unsupported spans, no cantilevered sections vulnerable to collapse. Contrast this with later Egyptian architecture. The temples at Karnak and Luxor are breathtaking, but they rely on columns, lintels, and roofs. Over thousands of years, roofs collapse. Columns crack. Lintels fall. The structures require constant maintenance to remain standing. The pyramids require no maintenance. They simply endure. Even the internal design reflects redundancy. The grand gallery, the ascending passage, the multiple chambers, all of it is over-engineered. The relieving chambers above the king's chamber serve no functional purpose for a tomb. They exist solely to protect the integrity of the space below by absorbing and redistributing stress. This is not the design philosophy of a culture building a single-use monument. This is the design philosophy of a culture that expects the structure to outlast everything around it, including the memory of why it was built. Why build for such permanence? One answer is ego. A pharaoh might wish his tomb to stand forever, a testament to his power. But ego doesn't explain the engineering overkill. Ego doesn't explain why the most durable features are hidden inside the structure, invisible to anyone who might admire it. Another answer is function. Perhaps the pyramids were not primarily tombs. Perhaps they served a purpose that required them to remain intact across vast stretches of time, a purpose tied to astronomy, to alignment, to encoded knowledge meant to survive, even if the culture that built them didn't. Messages require durability. If you want to communicate across thousands of years, you don't write on papyrus. You don't carve into wood. You build in stone. And you build it so well that time itself can't erase it. This logic appears elsewhere in history. The Georgia Guidestones, erected in 1980, were designed to survive catastrophic events and convey principles to future civilizations. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault is engineered to endure climate collapse, war, and societal breakdown. Both projects assume discontinuity. They assume that knowledge will be lost, that societies will fall, and that future generations will need guidance preserved in the most durable form possible. What if the pyramids operate on the same principle? Ancient flood myths found across cultures describe cycles of destruction. Civilizations rise, flourish, and then are wiped out by forces beyond their control: water, fire, darkness, ice. The survivors scatter, carrying fragments of the old world into the new. But the continuity is broken. If the builders of the pyramids lived in a world that had already experienced such cycles, if they understood that collapse was inevitable, then building for permanence becomes not vanity but necessity. You don't encode mathematics into stone if you believe knowledge will be safely passed through books and schools. You encode it into stone because you know books burn, schools close, and civilizations forget. The pyramids, in this light, are not monuments to the dead. They're monuments to survival anchors in time, designed to remain visible and intact, no matter what happens to the cultures that surround them. And they've succeeded. Empires have risen and fallen within sight of Giza. Languages have evolved and died. Religions have transformed. Climate has shifted. Yet the pyramids remain silent and immovable, exactly where they were placed. Later Egyptian monuments don't share this resilience. The temples, despite their grandeur, crumble. The statues erode. The tombs in the Valley of the Kings were looted and vandalized within centuries of their construction. Even the Sphinx, carved from softer limestone, shows significant weathering. But the pyramids built earlier, with greater precision, from harder materials endure. This suggests that durability was a primary design goal, perhaps the primary goal. That the builders were less concerned with immediate aesthetics or religious symbolism, and more concerned with creating something that couldn't be destroyed, not by time, not by weather, not by human hands. Something that would stand as proof. Proof that a civilization existed. Proof that knowledge existed. Proof that human beings, at some point in the deep past, achieved a level of understanding worth preserving beyond the reach of forgetting. The pyramids don't speak in words. They speak in dimensions, in alignment, in material choice, in structural redundancy. They say, we were here. We knew. And we built this so you would know that we knew. Even if you forget everything else, even if our names are lost, even if the purpose fades into myth, the stone will remain. And within the stone, the knowledge waits patient, encoded, indestructible. If the pyramids were intentionally designed to survive the collapse of civilizations, to endure across cycles of forgetting and rediscovery, then what kind of world were their builders preparing for? What did they know about the fragility of knowledge, the inevitability of collapse, that drove them to build monuments meant to outlast memory itself? In the entrance corridor of the Great Pyramid, carved into the limestone near the original descending passage, are marks left by medieval Arab explorers' graffiti, names, dates, evidence that even 1,000 years ago, long after Dynasty Egypt had ended, people entered the pyramid not knowing who built it, only that it was ancient, sacred, and worth exploring. By the 9th century AD, the pyramids were already mysteries. Their origins were debated. Their purpose was unclear. The casing stones were stripped. The interior passages were dark and silent. And yet the structure itself remained intact, unmoved, a presence that outlasted the civilization that claimed it. This is the paradox at the heart of Giza. The pyramids are simultaneously Egypt's most iconic symbol and its most mysterious inheritance. They defined the culture in the modern imagination, yet the culture itself left almost no explanation for how or why they exist. What remains is evidence, not stories but material facts. Stone, alignment, erosion, silence. And when you gather the evidence, when you set aside assumptions and look only at what the ground, the bedrock, and the monuments themselves reveal, a different story emerges. Not a story of invention, but of transmission. The Egyptians didn't need to invent the pyramids to be extraordinary. The achievement lies elsewhere. It lies in recognizing value in something they didn't create, in preserving structures whose original purpose they may not have fully understood, in maintaining continuity across thousands of years, ensuring that even when knowledge faded, the monuments endured. This is a rare form of greatness, not the brilliance of innovation, but the wisdom of stewardship. Consider what Egypt inherited. A prepared plateau. Foundations shaped during a wetter climate. Bedrock carved and leveled long before the 4th dynasty rose. Star knowledge encoded in alignment. Math constants embedded in proportion. Engineering techniques sophisticated enough to work granite with precision that later generations couldn't copy. The 4th dynasty didn't invent these elements. It applied them, brought them together, realized them in stone. And, in doing so, Egypt became a bridge of civilization that stood between an older world and a younger one, carrying forward fragments of knowledge it couldn't entirely reconstruct but refused to abandon. The later pharaohs understood this. Their inscriptions emphasized restoration, not creation. They cleared sand. They repaired damage. They consecrated spaces already ancient by their time. They honored the pyramids as sacred inheritances, not as monuments they could claim. This humility is revealing. If the pyramids were wholly Egyptian achievements, later dynasties would have boasted. They would have built larger, more complex structures to demonstrate their superiority. But instead, they approached Giza with reverence. They treated it as something beyond replication, something that belonged to an age they could no longer access. The decline in construction quality supports this. Early dynasty stonework is megalithic, precise, nearly indestructible. Later work shrinks in scale, simplifies in technique, relies on cement and smaller blocks. The path is not one of progress but of loss. Egypt didn't forget how to build. It forgot how to build like that. The difference is subtle but critical. You can lose a technique without losing the memory that the technique existed. You can preserve the form while forgetting the principle. You can continue a tradition without understanding why it began. This is how knowledge erodes, not through catastrophic destruction, but through the slow generational drift that occurs when transmission breaks. When masters die before fully training apprentices. When methods become ritualized rather than understood. When the why beneath the how fades into the realm of the sacred. And sacred things are honored, not questioned. Egypt carried this inheritance for 3,000 years longer than any other civilization in recorded history. It maintained temples, sustained rituals, preserved texts, and kept the monuments standing, even as the knowledge required to create them slipped away. That endurance is itself an achievement. But it also means that the pyramids don't mark the beginning of monumental civilization. They mark a transmission point, a moment when older knowledge was crystallized into stone, preserved by a culture that valued continuity more than novelty, and passed forward into a future that would one day forget its origin. The pyramids are not oddities. They're evidence of depth. Evidence that human history extends further back than the textbooks suggest, that knowledge systems existed before writing, before cities, before the civilizations we recognize. And those systems, whatever they were, understood permanence. They understood that collapse was inevitable, that memory was fragile, and that the only way to preserve knowledge across vast stretches of time was to encode it into something indestructible: stone, geometry, alignment, proportion. Not instructions, but demonstrations. Not explanations, but examples. The pyramids don't tell us who built them, but they show us that someone did. Someone who understood Earth's dimensions, the sky's movements, the principles of load-bearing structures designed to outlast empires. And Egypt, wise enough to recognize this, preserved it. Even when the methods faded, even when the purpose became mythologized, even when later generations could no longer copy the precision, they kept the monuments standing. They became caretakers of something greater than themselves. And in doing so, they elevated human history rather than diminished it. Because if the pyramids are inheritances, if they represent knowledge passed down from an earlier source, then history is not a straight line. It's layered. Civilizations rise, preserve, pass forward, and sometimes lose what they carried. The record is incomplete, fragmented, full of gaps where entire chapters have eroded into silence. But the stone remembers. The alignment holds. The dimensions encode truths that persist whether we understand them or not. This doesn't require conspiracy. It doesn't require aliens or lost continents. It requires only honesty. Honesty about what the evidence shows, about the limits of our knowledge, about the possibility that the past is deeper, older, and stranger than we've been taught. The pyramids stand as proof that human achievement reaches back further than we remember, that civilizations before Egypt may have risen, flourished, and faded, leaving behind not texts or cities, but knowledge passed forward, applied, preserved, and slowly forgotten. Egypt didn't build the pyramids from nothing, but it ensured they survived into a world that would one day ask the right questions. And perhaps that's enough. If the greatest monuments of the ancient world are not origins but inheritances, echoes of something older carried forward by cultures that valued preservation over pride, then how many other echoes lie buried, unrecognized, waiting beneath the surface of accepted history?